My name is John Spinks and I'm a photographer. I suppose I knew I wanted to be a photographer when I was in my late teens. Growing up, I had no connection to photography at all, really. And my relationship with photography started when I was at school. Shortly before I left, I discovered that there was a darkroom. Rumours circulated of the existence of a darkroom. And what was extraordinary about that darkroom in some ways was that it didn't work. The chemicals were rotten and the enlarger had no bulb. But what was great about it was that it meant that I could hide from all of the other kids. And that was my kind of first step towards knowing what photography might be or what it might offer me. So one of the other kids that knew a bit more about photography than I did and also hid in the darkroom told me that it was possible to study photography, which I had no idea that was a possibility. And so the following year, along with the other A-levels that I was doing, I started to study photography. So when I was 17, I went to the local, what was then a technical college, to study photography. And that was my first proper introduction to photography and everything that it meant. And the town that I grew up in was a really ordinary sort of industrial, post-industrial town in the Midlands. And the really, really fortunate thing for me was that it had an extraordinary art school. And the people that taught at this art school had an extraordinary knowledge of and belief in photography. And what photography did was it gave me a possibility of leaving that town and a future that up until that point I had no idea would be open to me. But what I learnt in those years at that technical college, I stayed there for 4 years in the end, and that was a couple more years than most people did before I went off to university. But that time, those formative years there, taught me everything that I ended up using as a photographer, really through the entirety of my career. And what I learned was a whole bunch of fascinating stuff, not technical stuff necessarily, but looking at other people's work, the work of other photographers. And that opened up a world to me I had no idea existed. And it gave me clues towards what my future might be. And that was extraordinary. That was a future I had previously been unable to imagine. And the photographer's work that I looked at, there was one photographer in particular called Josef Kudelka, who's a Czech photographer. And I looked at his work and it was magical. And it was a form of seeing that I had never encountered before. And it showed me a version of the world that was absolutely extraordinary. And that completely changed my life. After college, I went off to university for 3 years and learned a whole bunch of new stuff, but not really about technical or the technical aspects of photography, more about how people worked and what they did and what they were trying to do with their work. And so by the time I left university, I had an idea that I wanted to be a photographer, but I had no clue whatsoever how that might happen. And so I went back home to where my parents lived and where I'd grown up, and had a few weeks off, and then started to call around studios in London because that was the only way I could think of making a start. And one studio were much more kind of friendly than the rest. And they asked me to come down and cover people's holidays. And that was how I started my life as a commercial photographer. I was a studio assistant, and I stayed there for about a year. And that year taught me all of the technical skills that I needed to be a commercial photographer. And that was a sort of extraordinary time as well in lots of ways, because I could see the way lots of different photographers worked and how they approached their jobs and what jobs meant and all the different aspects of that way of life. And so after about a year, I went off to assist a photographer, a fashion photographer, which hadn't really been my intention at all. It all sort of happened by accident. And I spent the next couple of years working as an assistant to a fashion photographer. And that taught me a whole bunch of different things, which was how jobs worked and who people were and what their jobs were. And so it was a more intimate experience of how the business worked and really what people did and what their jobs meant. And that was a really important part of my development as a photographer. So after assisting for 2 years full time, I decided it was time to go and try and make a living on my own. And that was really frightening, because I went from having a job that it didn't pay an enormous amount of money, but it paid enough to keep me going, to placing myself in a situation where there was no indication that I was going to earn a living in anytime soon. And so I sort of assisted a few other people, and just maybe a day a week or 2 days a week, and started making my own pictures. And that was a very interesting time, because I was desperate not to make photographs that looked the way the person I'd worked for made photographs. And so I was kind of searching for quite a long time, searching for a way of doing it. And what I did was fall back on my education as a photographer from my time before my degree and during my degree, and really sort of spent a lot of time researching and trying to find out as much as possible about the photography that I liked. And the photography that I liked was mainly, at that time, was mainly American photography, American colour photography. And so that's what I pursued. I sort of got my bag of influences together, and whenever I got a job, I would sort of try to sort of think, how would I approach this and what would I do? And something that came out of that was about my approach to people and how I would photograph people and what portraits meant. And that was an enormously useful part of my education as a photographer, because communication is absolutely the most important thing to do, to communicate with someone while you're making a portrait of them. I'm always really nervous when I'm approaching a shoot or before a shoot. And so the thing that I figured out before long was that the people I was photographing had absolutely no idea what I was going to do and what this was all about. And I still use large format film cameras, which are extraordinary looking objects and haven't changed very much from when they were invented in the 1840s. So there are these extraordinary objects that these people are presented with. And so I realised how important it was to tell them exactly what it was I would be doing, because I'd be disappearing under a sheet at one point and they wouldn't be able to see me. And so what I would do was tell them exactly what was going to happen in the next sort of 10, 15 minutes, half an hour. And as soon as people realise what you're doing and why you're doing it, they calm down and they become much more at ease with themselves. And that made things so much easier, and it made things make sense both for me and for them. I took all of these influences that had been so important to me as a student, and I tried to kind of figure out how they might work if I used them on commissions in a commercial in a commercial context. And it took a long time to figure out how they might fit in and how useful they might be. And I was learning that, I suppose one of the most important things about my career as a photographer was learning so much of it on the job, making mistakes in public. And that wasn't always a comfortable experience, but it was always very useful. And so over the years, my work evolved, and I had to think very carefully about how I would change my approach to each commission and what they needed and what the language of commercial photography is like, and how you have to change your approach to answer the problems that are set by certain briefs. That was an important lesson to learn, I think, and I continue to learn it with every job that I do, and try to think quite carefully about what's possible within the sort of parameters of each job. The kind of work that I do is based in reality, and so my photographs are descriptions really of how things are. I don't change things too much, and because they don't really contain much in the way of a fantastical element, it was sometimes difficult to find places where I would fit in. And what happened eventually was that I established a sort of network, and I got to know people, and the people that I got to know were sympathetic to what I was doing and the ways I wanted to do things. And in the end, they would think of me when a job required my kind of seeing. And that wasn't always necessarily how I had imagined what I wanted to do. But those challenges that were set by trying to think about how I might be able to kind of turn my work, how I might be able to kind of sort of bend it around the face of the problems that I was set, was a really important lesson too, because I wasn't always the natural choice for certain jobs, and I had to think very carefully how I could make a living by changing what I did a little bit, pushing it towards what somebody needed rather than towards maybe what I would have wanted to do. And I think that's really important, because what you're trying to do is produce something. In order to make a living, you're trying to make something that answers a problem that's set by a client. You're working with someone, but you're also working for someone. And it's really important to find out who the people are that will be sympathetic to the kind of work that you do. I'm increasingly making personal work, or what people call personal work. And that is really storytelling. It's different stories about different things. And as I get older, the stories I'm telling them in more personal ways. And I use analogue equipment, and that analogue equipment invites chance, and it invites mistakes, and accepting those errors and the unexpected and the fortunate error is such a gift. And I think that's what I kind of hold on to and hold very tight to, is because I can't see the picture that I've just made. I don't know what it looks like. I've got a good idea of what it might look like. But chance and the happy accident are such extraordinarily powerful things in making something that I don't want to be able to predict what the outcome will be. In fact, that would be, for me, the worst possible thing, because it invites something that I can't imagine. And that separates an analogue human process from a digital process. It's like going into a library rather than making a search on the internet. You choose a book, it's sometimes purely on the colour of the spine or the typeface. And by doing that, it's a diffuse search. You just discover something entirely by accident. And that thing that you discover by accident can be life-changing. It can be extraordinarily magical. And I think it's important to hold on to chance as a way of making something completely new. The industry's changed enormously over my career, and it's difficult to know where it's going to go next. There are challenges for everyone, I think, making a living being one of the key ones, and I think defending processes and the way that we do things, and the revolution that's coming in the creative industries is one that we're all going to spend the next few years negotiating. And it's difficult to know how that's going to turn out, but that we have to kind of remain steadfast in our belief in photography and filmmaking and writing and all of the other ways of being creative, how that means that we're able to express what it is to be human and to use it within a context that will allow us to make a living. My advice to young people seeking a life based around creation, around photography or film or writing or whatever it is, music, whatever it is you're interested in. I think there are some, increasingly, my advice to students when I speak to them has little to do with photography. If I'm asked for what I think about photography and what people should do, I think that really relates to what I said a moment ago about one's own idiosyncrasies and the uniqueness of what goes on in your head and finding a way to kind of fluently express that. And that, some people are really good at it very early on. Some people, I think, find a way to it much later. But that is what makes each one of us unique. And that, I think, is the most fertile territory. That's what I look towards. That's what I think about a lot. What are my stories? What have I got to say? What has my experience given me? How does that make me unique in my own way? So I would say that as the first thing. The advice that has nothing to do with photography, I am always slightly embarrassed, but when I talk to students, I tell them anyway. And the things I say, I'm afraid, are kind of rather paternal, but I found them to be very valuable. And they are: get enough sleep, eat properly, and don't drink too much. And if you're able to control the financial aspects of your life so that your life is organised and that you look after yourself so that you feel that you can function to the best of your ability, you can be free in whatever it is you do creatively. And I think that's possibly the most important thing that I've learned.